Welcome back to Marshall McLuhan's 3 Laws, a mini-series where I'm trying to sort of compress core ideas of Marshall McLuhan, give you my interpretation of it, and most importantly talk about what these fundamental ideas mean for this current age where we're going through all the AI madness. Previously we talked about the first law, which is every augmentation is also an amputation, that whenever we augment humanity with a new technology, we inevitably lose some of its natural capacity and how we can go about this. We talked about the second law, which is every new technology resurrects an old ghost. So we talked about how AI becomes what we really dreamt of in terms of having personal profits, and how embodied AI is going to come back in the form of jinns and nises and other creatures like that. And now we're finally getting to the third law. But if you haven't watched the previous episodes, I would highly encourage you to start there. But today, let's talk about the third law. The third law of Marshall McLuhan, as I call it, is that every world that we create inevitably creates our own worldview. This is probably the most difficult idea of all the three, but it's also the most consequential in the long run. So let's dive in. The fundamental thought is that we don't just create tools, that whenever we create tools, these tools end up shaping us as well. Right, it's a fairly straightforward idea that when you create anything, this thing starts influencing you back because it gives you certain affordances, it gives you certain assumptions about how it is going to be used, and then as generations of people start using that, these assumptions sort of come back and they become baked into how they think and how they operate and what they assume to be true, what they assume to be good. An example of that would be we invent the housing technology, right? So it's wonderful. It protects us from the weather and from the elements, and we can live longer and not shiver in the cold. That's great. But inevitably, then cities arise, and our whole world changes as a result. And now, if you put a modern human who grew up in urban environments, if you put them back into the jungle, they're going to struggle massively, not just because their capacities have been amputated, as we discussed previously, but also because their assumptions about how the world works are different. These assumptions are shaped by the world that they live in. And the world that they live in was created by the technology that they invented. So that's sort of a fundamental idea of a longer arc where we create tools and then these tools influence us. We generate worlds inevitably with technology, and then we start inhabiting those worlds. And technology disappears into the background to the point of, we no longer notice it, but we still are subject to all of the assumptions that went into the making of this technology. I think this is massively important on a number of levels. If you look at the LLMs, there is a certain assumption that is built into the LLMs, both at the time of pre-train and the post-training and everything else, about what writing is. And so we all sort of go through this period of, ooh, this smells like LLM writing, I don't like it. But obviously that LLM writing is not something that came out of nowhere. It was actually, a result of all of us writing on the internet in the first place. And then early on, I think OpenAI hired a bunch of people from Kenya, where certain aspects of English were more prominent than in other places. The word like delve, for example, is very popular. And now whenever we see the word delve, we're like, oh, that's written by ChatGPT, but it's not, right? Well, it is, or maybe it's not. It's just that we invented a certain way of writing, then we embedded that way of writing into the technology, and then we go through the period where we go, oh, okay, that smells like that technology. But what the third law says is that if you sort of push that forward a few years, or maybe a couple of generations, you then have to think about the generation of kids who grow up reading mostly text written by the LLMs. And for them, this is what good writing sounds like. right? And so they lose this kind of special sense of smell, going like, this is written by the LLM, because this is what writing is. If you grow up reading mostly this kind of text, or listening mostly to this kind of music, or whatever the environment that you grow up in, that's what you absorb as the norm. You don't notice it. It doesn't smell. It's the water that you swim in. Therefore, as a fish, you don't necessarily have any awareness of the qualities of the water, right? So that is actually the most interesting part, that if we're not careful, probably if you believe Marshall McLuhan, then even if we are, like there's nothing we can do. The tools that we create, they end up shaping us and our perception of taste, right? So we create our tools, and then our tools shape our taste. So that's how it applies, for example, to the LLMs and to the written text. But the same goes for imagery, and the same goes for music, for example. That even your ability to perceive stuff is clearly influenced by sort of the cultural environment in which you live, right? So the famous example of that would be, if you grow up listening to Western music, you can mostly distinguish, the 12 tones of Western music. But if you grow up in India listening to classical Indian music, you will end up with most likely a more nuanced understanding, because you have the half tones and the quarter tones. But you also perceive things differently, because you have the assumption of, the rag and the chords not changing, versus the Western music where the chord change is the fundamental unit. So without going into all of the details, you get the point. When we create a tool first, the tool eventually starts influencing our taste, and that's when we change and we stop noticing the tool. But the affordances built into the tool, the way that tool was built, are then our affordances. We just stop noticing them. And so that's true for all sorts of media, and for all sorts of situations. But then the bigger picture is, it's not just tools. These tools create worlds. So the modern way of building, created the urban environment, and then that urban environment creates us. Okay, so that's the general idea, right? Tools, then worlds, then we inhibit those worlds, and then eventually we stop noticing those worlds just are us, or as much of our environment as anything else. Now, where this gets really interesting is where we think about the next frontier of AI. I'm sure you have heard of not just large language models, but large world models, right? So Genie 3, for example, from Google, and a bunch of others. All of these companies, what they're doing is they're saying, look, next word prediction, which essentially next token prediction, which is what LLMs are trained on, is just one aspect of the larger idea of next world state prediction, right? You sort of go and say, well, you want to learn how the world works. You want to be able to predict what is going to be the next state. If I have something over here, and my prediction, if I let go of it, is that it will fall down. How did I learn that prediction? Well, because I observed the world a number of times, and that's what happened. And these companies are saying, well, we can teach the models to do that as well, right? You can show to the models a bunch of videos, and they will infer from the videos the physics of the world, the spatial reality, the consistency, all of that kind of stuff. It has tremendous, economic potential, because once you have a good world model, you can then put your agents inside of that world model and train them in virtual environments, train robots in virtual environments. And if those virtual environments, they're closely related to the reality of the physical world, then this training will transfer. Now, think about this. We're basically creating worlds now, in a very practical sense, much more practically than people who were creating worlds before, like Tolkien or whatnot. And as we're creating these worlds encode certain assumptions that we bring over from our physical world. And it's in our best interest, from a pragmatic standpoint, to make sure that this world that we're creating in Genie is sort of as realistic as possible in some situations. And in others, we don't want it to be realistic, so we don't want it to reflect the real world. For example, a lot of really interesting technical work is going on right now to make sure that the physics of Genie 3 are accurate. What they're doing is they're using deterministic game engines, where they have physics actually according to the laws of Newton, and then they train video models on the output of that to make sure that the physics is just right, so that again, when you train robots in virtual environments, it translates as well as it can to the reality. Now, all of that, what all of that means is that when we're creating this world, we're essentially going to go through the phase of starting to live in it, right? We will start inhabiting these personal or collectively inhabited worlds. It, when it becomes a collective hallucination, like an urban environment, it becomes reality. And all the assumptions that we're making about how this reality would work are going to be the default world that we're going to live in. And that world is going to influence our worldview, right? Just like, the internet became the world that we live in, many of us. And then this world influenced our worldview dramatically, right? You can look at all the politics that is going on. I don't need to talk about that. The new worlds that we're creating, and the shape of them, whether they're going to be personal or shared, whether it's going to be physically accurate to this reality as we know it, or different, all of that over a course of time is going to be the water in which we swim, and therefore we'll stop noticing it. It will be our worldview, right? So that's McLuhan's third law. You start with a tool, you go into a world inevitably becomes a worldview once you live in it long enough. There was a great paper in 1993 by a futurologist named Mark Pesce, and he talked about that same idea in the context of VR. And what he called the final amputation was actually that, if we go all the way back to the first lecture, right, you amputate your attention, you amputate yourself. The last step in that arc is you amputate the world. You replicate the world, you create the world, and therefore you amputate the real world. And that's sort of, our escape, if you will, into the completely virtual realities, into the matrix, or we can choose not to do that for certain parts. But basically what McLuhan is saying is that it's inevitable, that one way or the other, the tools that we create end up building the world, that world ends up building our worldview. And so what we need to do as kind of humans going through that transition is really think about what are the consequences of that? What are the worldviews that are going to be created through that new reality that is being invented right now? And I find that fascinating to think about, because that is actually the level at which we need to be thinking, right? When our kids grow up in these virtual worlds, what will their worldview be? What will this be influenced by? What are the default assumptions that are going to be built into those worlds that they're not even going to be aware of, because they're going to be second nature to them and just the way the reality works? That is kind of the longer term implication, which I find absolutely fascinating to think about. But that's it for now. Obviously, I would highly encourage you to go ahead to the source. As always, read Marshall McLuhan himself, read Mark Pesce, read a whole lot of other wonderful things that are available to explore this relationship that humans have with technology. But I wanted to share with you the three laws of Marshall McLuhan as I understand them, as I see them, as I conceptualize them. And I think they can be very, very practical for anybody who is trying to build with AI, understand how AI influences their life, right? The first law is every augmentation is also an amputation. The second law is that every new technology resurrects an old ghost. So we need to be mindful of what we're amputating, of what kind of ghosts we are resurrecting, and where that thing will go. And then every world that we create, and we inevitably create worlds, is really becoming a worldview for the next generation. And so we really need to be mindful about what are the assumptions in these worlds, what are sort of the physics of those worlds that the next generation will absolutely not even question, because it will be just second nature. It will be just the nature of reality. That's going to be the reality in which they live, and therefore that will form their worldview. That concludes the mini-series. Thank you very much for hanging around. I hope you found this useful, and yeah, talk to you next time.